They arrived hollow-eyed, clutching the remnants of a world that had already collapsed into ash. Their boots were cracked, their uniforms stiff with mud and soot, their hands trembling with the residue of hunger that had never left them. They had been told that across the ocean, in the hands of their enemies, there would be cruelty, humiliation, perhaps even death. And yet, as the great steel belly of the ship opened onto American soil, something entirely different awaited them. In that moment the world tilted, the soap in their palms felt almost holy, the bread so abundant it seemed indecent, and the faces of the guards who watched them were not masks of hatred, but strangely human. For women who had grown up beneath the shadow of the Reich, trained to expect only brutality from the enemy, this was the first betrayal they welcomed. If you find yourself drawn into these forgotten corners of history, into the voices of those who lived between fear and astonishment, I invite you to linger with us, like, share and subscribe, not for numbers, but so these stories of fragile humanity in the heart of war can keep breathing. The final days of the Reich did not end with a bang, but with the slow decay of a people too exhausted to even raise their voices. The cities had already turned into landscapes of silence, streets once cobbled and proud now drowned in rubble, walls scorched and brittle, windows shattered, like broken eyes staring into a future that no one could see. In the heart of this ruin walked women who had once been promised victory. They carried buckets of water across streets where buildings leaned like dying giants, their skirts stiff with soot, their bodies thin with hunger. Every step they took seemed to grind into their bones the truth that the stories they had been fed were lies. Anna wrote in her diary that may that silence was heavier than the sound of artillery. She described the way neighbors stopped greeting one another, their mouths too dry for words, their eyes too weary for recognition. She had once believed in the promise of the Reich, in the thunder of parades and the flags that flapped like storms over her town square. But now those flags were nothing but rags, trampled into mud, and the parades had given way to processions of widows lining up for meager bread rations. It was in this silence that the soldiers came, not German soldiers anymore, but American ones, their uniforms clean and their faces stern. To Anna and the women beside her, they were the monsters she had been warned about since girlhood. Propaganda had painted them as savages who would desecrate, torment, and enslave. So when the announcement came that they would be taken as prisoners, fear was not merely fear, it was certainty of horror. They gathered what little they had, a scarf, a broken brooch, a diary tucked into a skirt pocket, and the thin coats that smelled of smoke and unwashed fabric. The march toward captivity was not marked by violence, but by humiliation of a quieter kind. They walked through villages where children no longer played, past men too old to fight who stared at them with the bitterness of betrayal. They were women, not soldiers, but to the broken people of Germany, they were reminders of defeat. Stones were not thrown, but looks were. Anna wrote that the stairs felt colder than winter itself. At night, they were herded into makeshift holding areas, barns stripped of animals, empty schools that echoed with the ghosts of children's laughter. They lay on straw that pricked their skin, their stomachs groaning with hunger, their lips cracking from thirst. Anna described how one woman cried in the dark, whispering the names of her children, while another muttered prayer that sounded like fragments of a forgotten language. They were not warriors, yet they were captives all the same. The hunger carved itself deeper with each passing day. Meals were little more than thin broth, its watery surface dotted with floating specks that mocked the idea of nourishment. Bread was hard as stone, and so scarce that they broke it carefully as though handling relics. Anna wrote of chewing slowly, of pressing the crust against her tongue until it softened enough to swallow, and of the way even this meager ritual became an act of survival. Yet what haunted her most was not the hunger, but the collapse of certainty. For years, she had believed the Reich when it said Germany stood invincible, when it warned that enemies lurked outside the borders like wolves waiting for blood. But as the days of captivity stretched forward, she began to sense that the wolves were gone, and in their place stood something stranger, the unknown. She had no image to cling to anymore, no future to imagine. Her world had narrowed to footsteps in mud, the shuffle of weary women beside her, and the looming promise of ships that would carry them to their enemy's land. One evening, as the setting sun bled across the ruined horizon, Anna sat against a collapsed wall and pressed her diary to her knees. She wrote that she no longer feared death as much as she feared not knowing what awaited her across the ocean. She wondered if dignity could survive captivity, if hunger could give way to kindness, or if the Reich had been right all along and cruelty was the only truth left in the world. Her handwriting trembled on the page, but she forced herself to finish the thought. She wrote, "The world has already ended once. I do not know if there is another world waiting for us, or only the shadow of this one." That night, she closed the diary and tucked it under her arm as though it were a shield. Outside, the air was heavy with the smell of ash, and the horizon glowed faintly where fires still smoldered in the wreckage of homes. Tomorrow they would march again, farther away from everything familiar, deeper into the arms of their supposed enemies. The Reich had promised them death at the hands of Americans, and yet, in the hollow of her hunger, Anna began to wonder if death might already be behind her, and something else, unknown, impossible, waited just ahead. The ships that waited in the harbor loomed like iron beasts, their flanks glistening with salt and oil. To the women who shuffled toward them, each step was a surrender, not only of land, but of self, a passage from one identity into another. Anna wrote that the air tasted of metal and brine, and when she looked up at the towering hulls, she felt smaller than she had ever felt in her life. They had been raised on stories that the ocean was a boundary, a shield that separated the Reich from its enemies. Now, that same expanse had become a bridge, one they would cross, not in triumph, but in chains. Boarding the ship was chaos woven with silence. Guards gestured sharply, corralling the prisoners into the bowels of the vessel where light seemed to wither. The air grew thick almost instantly, heavy with the mingling of sweat, damp wool, and the acrid sting of fuel. Bodies pressed against one another in the dim corridors, the shuffle of boots muffled by the hum of machinery. Anna clutched her diary close, her other hand gripping the sleeve of a woman she barely knew, both of them afraid of being swallowed by the crowd. The voyage began with a jolt, the engines rumbling through the floor like the growl of some unseen animal. Many of the women collapsed against the walls, dizzy with seasickness and dread. The first hours were marked by retching, by whispered prayers, by the hollow sound of sobbing muffled into sleeves. The Atlantic spread itself around them like a vast and indifferent god, its waves pounding the hull with an endless rhythm that made sleep both impossible and inescapable. Days blurred quickly. Meals, if they could be called that, arrived in metal tins, stew so greasy it clung to lips, bread that was edible only because hunger demanded it. Anna described eating with mechanical obedience, her mind drifting between memories of the hunger back home and the strange abundance even these rations represented. It was not comfort, but it was more than ruins had given her. She wondered if this paradox was only the beginning. At night, when the engines softened to a steadier rhythm, the ship filled with whispers. Rumors spread like wildfire in the dark. That the Americans planned to execute them upon arrival. That they would be forced into endless labor, that families would never see each other again. Others whispered, almost guiltily, that perhaps the Americans would feed them, that perhaps rumors of cruelty were only stories spun to keep them loyal to a collapsing Reich. These conversations flared and faded like candles sputtering in a storm, never lasting long enough to offer certainty. Anna wrote about the sea as though it were alive. She described the way the horizon disappeared into a seamless grey, how gulls vanished after the first days, and how the ship seemed to exist in a suspended world of water and sky. Sometimes, at night, she would close her eyes and imagine that the waves were voices, speaking a language older than war. The ocean became both enemy and comfort, a vastness that promised transformation whether they wished it or not. The women clung to fragments of normalcy. One sang softly in the corner, a lullaby for children she would not see again for months, perhaps years. Another stitched at a torn sleeve, though the needle pricked her trembling fingers. These small acts of survival became sacred, as though holding on to the gestures of daily life could anchor them in a reality that no longer existed. One night, when the ship groaned beneath the weight of a storm, Anna recorded how the waves rose higher than the portholes, sheets of water lashing the steel with a violence that rattled even the guards. The women huddled together, praying, cursing, clinging to each other with the desperation of those who feared the sea might claim them before America could. When morning came and the storm eased, the air was filled with a strange silence, broken only by the coughs and sighs of the living. Anna wrote that the storm had stripped them bare, leaving only the raw truth. They were already farther from Germany than they had ever been, and the land awaiting them would not be home, but it would not be ruins either. As days stretched into weeks, routine dulled the terror. The pounding of the engines became the pulse of their existence, the ration lines their only markers of time. Yet, beneath the surface of monotony, a quiet transformation brewed. Hunger no longer consumed them in the same way. Guards, while stern, were not cruel. And the horizon, once a symbol of dread, began to glow faintly, with the possibility of something else. Anna ended one of her entries with a line that seemed both hesitant and daring. "If death waits for us in America, then let it be death with bread in the stomach and water on the skin. But if life waits, I do not know what kind of life it will be." When at last the ship's horn bellowed against the morning air and the outline of the American coast rose like a shadow made of gold, the women fell into silence. They pressed against the rails, staring at a land that was neither friend nor foe, but something entirely foreign. Anna held her diary tighter, her fingers aching from the grip, and whispered that she felt as though she was stepping out of the ashes of one world and into the uncertainty of another. The first sight of America was not the barbed wire they had imagined, but a skyline shimmering faintly in the morning haze. The harbour smelled of salt and coal, the air sharper and cleaner than the soot-choked ruins they had left behind. Anna wrote that as the ship slowed, she felt the earth itself had shifted beneath her. The land before her seemed too vast, too bright, almost obscene in its calm. They had expected to see a monster's den, but what unfolded looked instead like a country untouched by war's teeth. A place where buildings still stood straight and whole, where windows still glittered instead of yawning, empty. The descent from the ship was slow and disorienting. Guards in crisp uniforms guided them down gangways, their faces unreadable. The women braced themselves for shouts, for blows, for the cruelty they had been promised. But the Americans' commands were firm, without malice, sharp enough to demand obedience but never laced with hatred. Anna described the sensation as almost unbearable, to be treated not with kindness but with indifference. It was not warmth, but it was also not the cruelty she had been raised to expect. That absence of hatred felt stranger than anything else. The first true shock came in the form of food. After registration, after hours of waiting in pens where the sun pressed hard against their backs, the women were handed trays of bread, soup, and coffee. The bread was soft, almost too soft, collapsing beneath their fingers. The soup steamed, thick with vegetables and meat that floated in greasy abundance. And the coffee, black, bitter, but hot, slid down their throats like fire and left behind a warmth they had nearly forgotten. Anna pressed her nose against the bread before eating, inhaling the yeasty perfume, and wrote later that it smelled like a dream she had once had as a child. They ate in silence at first, too stunned to speak, each mouthful chewed slowly as though it might vanish if swallowed too quickly. Then whispers spread, astonished, suspicious, fearful that the generosity was a trick. Some women hesitated, nibbling cautiously, their eyes darting toward the guards as though punishment would follow each bite. But punishment never came, only refills. The guards moved among them with pitchers of water and extra ladles of soup, and the sight was so surreal that Anna admitted she could hardly raise her spoon. She felt as though she had stepped into a betrayal, not of her captors, but of the stories she had been forced to believe. The second shock was the shower. Herded into facilities that smelled faintly of soap and metal, the women stripped reluctantly, clutching thin towels against their ribs. The pipes rattled, the valves turned, and then streams of hot water cascaded over them. For years, they had bathed only in basins with water cold and grey, rationed by the cup. Now it poured freely, rushing down in sheets that softened grime until it slid from their skin, like another layer of war peeling away. The women laughed, first in disbelief, then louder, giddy, their voices echoing against the tiled walls. The laughter was jagged, as though it cut them while it healed. Anna wrote of her hands trembling when she reached for the soap. It was small and oval, pink like a seashell, fragrant in a way she had never known. She turned it over in her palms, slippery and absurdly delicate, and pressed it to her face as though it were a holy relic. The lather foamed between her fingers, sliding over her skin with a gentleness that undid her. She thought of the ashes still clinging to her hair, back in Germany, of the weeks of dirt and sweat. And suddenly, she could not stop crying. She wept openly as the water fell around her, her tears lost in the steam, while the women beside her scrubbed and sang and fell into silence. When they emerged, their bodies clean, their hair damp and shining, they felt almost unrecognizable. Their ragged clothes betrayed them as prisoners, but their skin glowed with the freshness of lives they had thought impossible. Anna confessed in her diary that she felt guilty for enjoying the sensation, as though washing herself was a betrayal of the hunger and filth her family still endured back home. Yet she also admitted that she had never felt more alive. That evening, they lay in bunks within the camp for the first time. The mattresses were rough, the blankets thin, and yet the straw beneath them did not prickle, and the air no longer reeked of ruin. Outside, the crickets hummed, steady and indifferent, while the women whispered in the dark. Some whispered gratitude, some suspicion, some only names of children they feared, would forget them. Anna wrote that she pressed her hand against her chest and realized she was not afraid in the same way anymore. Fear had been replaced by something stranger. Confusion, relief, even a flicker of gratitude she could not admit aloud. In that moment, lying beneath the American sky, she understood that captivity would not be what she had imagined. The Reich had promised brutality, but what she had found instead was soap, bread, and dignity. And though the fences still stood high, though her freedom was gone, Anna realized that she had entered a different kind of prison, one where the bars were not made of iron, but of her own unraveling beliefs. The camp was a paradox, its fences high, its gates locked, yet its air wide and strangely unburdened. From a distance, the compounds looked like any orderly village, rows of barracks, neat paths beaten by boots, wooden towers standing like watchful trees, but it was the sky that startled them most. After years of smoke, blackened horizons, the American sky seemed boundless, rolling endlessly above them in hues of gold and blue. For the first time in months, Anna wrote, she could breathe without tasting ash. Life behind fences was structured, not chaotic. At dawn, the women were roused by whistles, the clang of boots against the floorboards, and the crisp shouts of guards who never lingered longer than necessary. Work assignments varied, some in fields harvesting crops, others in kitchens peeling endless potatoes, a few sewing uniforms or mending linens. Tasks that might once have felt like drudgery now carried a strange dignity, because the work was neither forced with cruelty nor weighted with starvation. In return came food, always food, and wages, meager but tangible. Anna confessed in her diary that earning even a few coins while wearing the title of prisoner unsettled her. She could not reconcile the idea of labor rewarded, especially when she remembered working at home until her hands cracked and still being handed only hunger. Evenings carried their own rhythm. The women gathered in the yard, some walking in circles to stretch their limbs, others sitting in the grass with eyes turned toward the fence. Conversations fluttered in the air like restless birds. Some spoke of home, of children's faces they conjured like prayers, while others whispered dreams of never returning. Guilt ran beneath every word. How could one laugh in captivity when families starved in ruins? How could one savor bread when a sister across the ocean gnawed on bark and hope? Anna wrote that the guilt was like a second shadow, following even in the brightest hours. And yet laughter came. It came in bursts, startled and unbidden, when someone tripped over a bucket, or when a song from childhood slipped past trembling lips. The Americans allowed music, even instruments, and on some nights, violins sang across the compound. The sound cut deep, pulling tears from those who could not decide whether it reminded them of life before or of life forever lost. Anna described one evening when the women sang softly together, their voices weaving in and out of the dusk, until even the guards stood silently, listening. The diary grew heavier with contradictions. Anna recorded her astonishment at the abundance in the camp's canteen. Milk, cheese, even chocolate bars that children at home would never touch again. She wrote of a guard who handed her an apple, its skin red and smooth as polished glass. She turned it in her palm, ashamed of the pleasure it gave her, then ate it slowly, each bite crisp, sharp, and impossibly sweet. That night she lay awake, wondering how an enemy could offer such gifts while her own nation had left her with nothing but ashes. But kindness was never without conflict. The women wrestled with loyalty, torn between gratitude and shame. Some muttered that the Americans' generosity was only strategy, a way to break them, to turn them into traitors. Others argued that kindness was kindness, no matter its source. Anna's diary trembled between these poles. One page would marvel at the food, the order, the unexpected dignity. The next would scold herself, ink smeared where her hand pressed too hard, accusing herself of weakness for accepting what her enemy gave. There were moments of tension, too. Guards barked orders with harsh precision, and the fence, though unyielding, always reminded them that freedom was gone. Escape was futile. Some tried, few succeeded. Most returned with despair written across their faces. The fences did not simply hold them in, they held their thoughts captive as well. Anna wrote that she often stared through the wire, imagining the horizon beyond, wondering if it led to freedom or simply to another kind of cage. At night, the camp grew quiet except for the hum of crickets and the occasional cough echoing through the barracks. The women lay in their bunks, the air heavy with whispers and the creak of shifting bodies. Anna confessed to both dread and peace. She was safe, she admitted, safer than she had been in Germany's ruins, but safety was its own torment because it demanded the admission that her enemy had given her what her homeland could not. The chapter of camp life was one of contradictions stitched together, captivity and freedom, guilt and gratitude, silence and song. Behind the fences, Anna and the women discovered not the cruelty they had braced for, but something far stranger, a life where survival was no longer in question, but identity was. And every night, as Anna closed her diary, she felt the weight of the question pressing harder. If the enemy could give dignity, then what had her own nation truly given her at all? Time in the camp did not pass like time in the outside world. Days folded into one another, stitched together by the rhythms of work, meals, and the guarded silence of nights. And yet, even within this strange order, there was a ticking clock none could escape. The war had ended. Germany lay in ruins. And soon the women who had lived, and in many ways healed, within American fences would have to go back. The first whispers of repatriation spread like smoke. At first, no one believed them. How could they return to a place that no longer existed as they remembered it? Their towns were rubble, their families scattered, their country divided into zones patrolled not by Germans, but by foreign uniforms. To leave the camp was to step back into uncertainty, into hunger, into judgment. And judgment was the shadow that haunted them most. Anna filled her diary with fears she could not speak aloud. She had survived better in captivity than her sisters had in freedom. She had eaten meat, drunk coffee, washed her skin with fragrant soap. How could she return to a village where children rummaged in trash for potato peels and expect to be welcomed? What words could she offer to a neighbor who had starved while she had lived with bread on her plate? Gratitude toward the Americans felt like betrayal, and yet denial felt like a lie too heavy to carry. As departure drew closer, the camp shifted in mood. Women who had once laughed in the evenings now sat silent, staring at the fences as though they wished to memorize them. The irony was unbearable. The fences had once represented captivity, but now they felt like protection from a harsher world beyond. Anna wrote of one night when she and a friend walked along the perimeter, fingers brushing the wire, speaking of nothing. They both understood, without saying it. The return was not a homecoming, but another exile. Some tried to prepare by hoarding. They tucked away soap, chocolate, scraps of paper, anything they could carry back as proof that this strange chapter of dignity had been real. Others burned their diaries, terrified that written gratitude toward the enemy might brand them traitors. Anna considered the flames, but in the end she kept her book. She could not destroy the only witness to her transformation, even if those pages condemned her. The final days came with ceremonies of departure. Trains lined with soldiers waited at the edge of the camp, their engines sighing like reluctant beasts. The women boarded slowly, many with tears that blurred their vision of the barracks they were leaving behind. Anna pressed her face against the window as the camp receded into the distance. She wrote that she felt as though she were abandoning not captivity, but a strange sanctuary, a place where she had been forced to see her enemy not as monsters, but as men. The journey back was different from the one that had carried them across the Atlantic. There was no dread of the unknown now, only dread of the known. They travelled through a country that had not been shattered by war, past fields that still bloomed, rivers that still glittered. Then, slowly, Europe returned. The scars of bomb craters, the ruins of villages, the silence of a continent that had been broken and stitched together again with pain. When Anna stepped once more onto German soil, she felt smaller than she ever had before. The air was heavy with smoke, even months after the last bombs had fallen, and the eyes that met hers were not filled with welcome. There was suspicion, resentment, even contempt. She carried an apple in her bag, a gift pressed into her hand by a sympathetic American guard at the moment of departure. She thought of sharing it, but when she looked into the faces of those around her, she knew it would only brand her as different. She ate it alone that night, in silence, tasting both sweetness and shame. Her diary entries after her return grew shorter, sharper. Gratitude still flickered through her words, but it was shadowed by fear of judgment. She wrote of neighbors who asked where she had been, of the silence that followed when she admitted she had been in America. She did not speak of soap, of showers, of bread, or of laughter. She buried those memories deep within the pages of her diary, sealing them away like contraband. And yet, even as years passed, she could not forget. She could not forget the soap in her hands, the bread on her tongue, the sky above the camp that stretched wider than the ruins of home. She could not forget that the world she had been told to fear had shown her a measure of dignity she had never expected. The reckoning was not in choosing sides, but in carrying both truths at once. That her homeland had betrayed her with lies, and her enemy had betrayed her with kindness. Anna's diary closes not with resolution, but with a question that lingers like smoke in the air. What does it mean to survive if survival itself becomes the burden you cannot lay down? And so the story ends not with clarity, but with echoes of footsteps across a ruined land, of laughter behind fences, of soap slipping through trembling hands. The war had ended, but for Anna and countless others, the reckoning had only begun.